It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Gerhard Demmer. I'm representing Crypt.am, co-founder and CIO. And we're going to have a very exciting panel today. Quickly introduce you guys. I prepared a couple of notes to give you a brief introduction. So to my right, very proud, we have been working a bit together already, Dr. Florian M. Spiegel. He's an entrepreneur and fintech practitioner, co-founder and CEO of FinFabrik, Hong Kong-based fintech company providing capital markets technology and services focused on emerging crypto asset class. I think I couldn't have said that better, right? FinFabrik solutions power business and digital asset issuance, trading and investing. Also previously digital banking at Credit Suisse, Boston Consulting Group, and he has a PhD in political economics as founding member of the FinTech Association. You're welcome. Then to his right is in the middle, Professor Nicolas Krappels, also called Professor K. He's an American writer, educator, entrepreneur who has lived for several years now in China. He's MD for China and blockchain lead at Dark Matter. I think that's a name most people have heard about. He also teaches at Shanghai University, and he's organizing events under the banner of the international group of FinTech Connector. And he's basically Shanghai University is David. Tongi, yeah. You told me to say that. And then to his very right is Greg Wolfson. Greg is Director of Strategic Partnerships with the Digital Assets Group at Shares Post, a private securities market based in the US. He previously worked at Element Group and BTCC. M&A and due diligence experience. He has a BA from Tufts and an MBA from the National University of Singapore. Wonderful. So we have this. Let's start with Professor Krappels.
Yes, hello.
You would like to give us a quick introduction of what the topic actually is. The topic, to remind us, is the real the tokenization of real assets, right? What is that about? How do you feel about it? And maybe can you give like 2 examples and elaborate on one?
So it's a very broad topic. Last year was a huge market for, or maybe 2017 was a huge market for ICOs, which are what we call utility tokens. They don't really represent any equity rights or anything. They're just sort of like selling your future services on the platform. This year, we're hearing more and more about what they call STOs, or digital asset-backed digital tokens. Kind of the basic, easy example is gold. There's something called Digix DAO. They basically, I have a token that represents 1 gram of gold. That's kind of interesting, but not exactly revolutionary. More interesting things that I think that it would fall into this real-world asset tokenization space are things like non-fungible tokens that represent like professional football players and what they might be able to do, like if you want to trade or own a piece of their earnings. Another real-world asset tokenization that I personally research is the sort of the cryptographic tokens issued by central banks. To me, that's probably the more interesting use of the technology. Being that I'm based in China, that's something that I'm looking at a lot. What we do at Dark Matter, though, is basically we focus on tokenizing funds. There are only a very few funds out there that have actually issued a token. I think Blockchain Capital is one of them. Invictus Capital has a lot of tokens that are funds. But those guys are raising money in the islands, so we don't necessarily have any regulatory clarity that these tokens actually represent shares in those funds. So what we're trying to do at Dark Matter is create like a soup to nuts solution. So if you're a fund, you want to go ahead and raise capital in a compliant way, you can do that on our platform, and then you can create the token that will ride on whatever exchange that you end up choosing to list on. But the issue right now is what technology do we use to tokenize those funds? Yesterday we had Cardano up here talking about they have a solution, and Aeon has a solution, and Stellar Lumens has a solution, and Ravencoin and Florin Coin and Hyperledger. All of these different blockchain, they want to be the home for your security tokens. How do you navigate that as a fund that wants to tokenize? How do you create this token? That's basically where we're at when we're talking about real-world asset tokenization. So, sort of a quick background.
Okay, wonderful. That sounds very interesting. Maybe if you have some time, you can elaborate later on the monetizing part. Florian, you want to say something?
I just wanted to add something. Thanks for that introduction. First of all, I think the boring use cases are the interesting use cases right now, as we are on that journey.
Stable coins,
all of that. And second, the word rights is important. I think it can go from ownership rights, as you described, to the second group, claim rights, claim to a dividend or an asset flow or a cash flow that is produced by the underlying asset, and finally governance rights, where people can vote on what is supposed to happen with the asset. That is something that we already see now, and where I think where the interesting use cases are coming out, at least from our perspective on the institutional side, where they digitize and automate those workflows and can create new products based on the assets that they are already dealing in. I think this is where a lot of the dynamic comes from at this moment.
Yeah, well said. Greg, do you maybe want to add something to that? Otherwise, we go to the next topic, which is regulation, jurisdiction. Can you say
sure,
something about that?
Very briefly, I'll add that. So SharesPost is a digital ATS and self-clearing broker-dealer located in San Francisco in the States. We've been around for about 10 years in the private securities market and are essentially using blockchain technology to digitize a lot of the things that we've been doing historically, and effectively we'd like to use it to restructure the private shares market and make it a much more liquid marketplace, and add a lot of new types of assets that make a much more interesting trading and investing proposition for our client base of about 150,000 accredited investors.
Okay, and now back to the question. So, can you say something? What is the value for you of like real life tokenization? And maybe can you elaborate a bit on the jurisdiction part?
Sure. I mean, I think that what we've seen over the 2017, 2018, where it was a lot of very very amateur behavior in market abuses with these sort of people issuing tokens that like literally entitle you to nothing on platforms that don't exist, and that proposition is imploded very severely, and I don't see that coming back at all. I think we're seeing that investors want something that have some sort of fundamentals behind them, and that's where real world assets are going to be necessary. It must represent something and have some sort of utility. Most of the platforms that were issued during that time, as Dave pointed out in the last panel, they're not even up and operating, and also there's a massive disconnect between the valuation of the tokens and the actual value that can be derived on the network. So I think that the bubble hasn't burst yet. I think there's a lot more air that should be taken out of the so-called utility token market.
There's really not even a way to value these utility tokens. So some of them may actually be very undervalued at this point, and some of them, especially like the ghost tokens, will be worth zero. But how do you separate the wheat from the chaff there? There's no model to really tell you that you should invest in this one and you should leave that one alone right now. So that's why we still have some value as a trading vehicle, and the potential that maybe 5 years down the line this platform will become something useful.
Florian, you see like you want to say something towards
you
that?
know me, David, I always like a good structure, so let me run through why are we even tokenizing assets? Because you have to start with that question. We come from the traditional trading side, we're dealing with equities and other traditional asset classes, so why would we deal in digital assets and focus on that? To me, it's a couple of things. The first one is about accessibility. You're allowing more people to have access to assets that they don't have access to today, because you're lowering the ticket size. You're creating smaller investable units, and I think that's more of a long-term topic. The second is tradability. You add liquidity into markets that deal with highly illiquid assets. As an example, one client that we have in China is a perfectly already working exchange of intellectual property rights. But it's super inefficient and it's super illiquid. So by tokenizing, you can basically help the tradability of that asset. It's number two. Number three, if you have the first two, you can create investability, which means you can very efficiently create diversified portfolios of those underlying assets. So in essence, you can invest with $10,000 like someone who has 50 million US dollars into the same asset class. And finally, I think what we're seeing now playing, in our case at least, the most important role is automation, programmability of workflows. This is what the relatively large asset issuers are looking for, efficiency in their workflows, and the rest will come later. But I think there always needs to be the why at the beginning. And what we will see this year, we'll see a lot of projects that don't ask and answer that question, which means we see a lot of, pardon my French, crap in the token. It has no point and will die just like the utility tokens and other things. I think that's number one. If I also may add on the jurisdiction or on the regulatory question, I think it's very, very simple. We call those assets digital asset-backed securities. 99% of them are securities and they have to live within the existing regulatory frameworks as securities. There is no workaround. There is no, but my asset is an exception from that. I think it's very clear. That's number one. And number two on regulation is we'll see the regulatory frameworks evolve and adapt to this new digitized way of dealing with assets, but that will take time. So I think it's quite straightforward. You have to be regulated. You have to stay within the frameworks that are there. And of course understand the jurisdictions. I don't think there's a lot of regulatory arbitrage possible at the moment.
Do you guys have any, it's not really, and I didn't really plan to talk about it, but do you have any favorite jurisdiction where you think you should launch any security token? Is that maybe like Singapore versus Hong Kong? Any opinion on that?
You could tell me what you think about this, but I always tell people, you want to launch a security token, why not launch it in America? There's already established...
SFC?
There's already established exemptions. So use those exemptions, the Reg D, the Reg CF, whatever. And you've got a very robust... people don't like the 1933 Securities Exchange Act, but it exists and it still oversees the entirety of the legislation in America on securities. So if you're going to do a securities token offering, yeah, you're not going to get $30 million like a utility token or $100 million or whatever was happening a couple of years ago. But I mean, to get $5 million, yeah, do it in America. And that way, and here's my story is because, so we have investors in Korea. And when we talk to the people in Korea, and we talk to the regulators in Korea, they say, well, there is no such thing as a compliant token. And I say, why? Because you can use these American exemptions to raise security. Like, yeah, but we're not touching it. So until there is some kind of clarity from America on these, and we don't just use these exemptions, we have a specific rule, then people in the rest of the world don't seem like they're going to touch it. So just raise in America, and then that proves to the rest of the investors that it's okay. And then you can go to the other jurisdiction. That seems to be.
I would agree with that. So we at Shares Post we trade. We're able to trade Reg D and Reg S on our ATS. We also do primary distribution and secondary trading, and the United States, it's a lot of jurisdictions do tend to follow the lead of what we're doing, and we're moving quite quickly with it. I speak to a lot of the exchanges in Korea and in Japan, and it seems that they're sort of in limbo right now. Everyone is very interesting, but no one's moving forward with anything meaningful so far. So we're ready to go live with our order book exchange. We also built on top of it a platform called Glass, which is the global liquidity and settlement system, which enables compliance and order book pooling between exchanges. So effectively, exchanges can piggyback on top of each other's licensing and trade across jurisdictions in this way. So this is a really useful example of the way that we've been able to apply blockchain in making the private securities market a global market with a lot greater depth and many more options for trading.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that insight. Generally, I think we all agree that the blockchain technology and its underlying assets is the underpinning of a new financial infrastructure. In the same way, the internet was the infrastructure for where we are today. And actually, just to throw in a number, which is quite interesting, I saw that yesterday while preparing for this talk. The World Economic Forum predicts that over the next 10 years, 10% of the world's GDP is going to be stored in crypto assets. I think that is a massive number, and that was new to me because, especially when you consider that the world GDP right now is 80 trillion. So we're talking about 8 trillion. With a bit of growth, maybe 8.5 trillion. So, and we're right now at 0.13 trillion, just to remind us. Cool. Florian, I want to hand over to you. I think you're in a run there. Can you elaborate a bit more on the value side, or you said already, you gave 4 points, which absolutely are really good to see that as a structured answer. But can you elaborate a bit more on the technical side, like how is it done, or maybe you, I think you love REITs, right? Do you want to talk a bit about that, about what the value there is, or?
Sure, and coming back to that, I just wanted to add to that, is that also shows you how early we are in that journey, and that we always have to be mindful that these are still very early days, and we have a long way to go and a lot to deliver, also a lot to deliver against promises that we make. But maybe back to that question, I think it's a very broad question, but I'm trying to narrow it down a bit based on our case. Because the answer to the technical question is going to be very different depending on the strategy of the player and of the company. So maybe let me start with what is our strategy, what is our core hypotheses. The number one is that we are working and empowering institutions, and the most interesting volumes for the foreseeable future for digital asset-backed securities will come from institutions because they sit on the most interesting assets that are really worth investing. That's number one. Number two, we don't foresee, and this is where maybe we have a different view, we don't foresee massive trading volumes in the retail market anytime soon because the assets are much harder to understand in a lot of cases. Another case that we have is more like a bond hybrid product. It's perfect for a family office. The average retail investor, first of all, would not be allowed to invest into it and would not understand it. So we will see the not crypto type trading on exchanges. We see different ways of subscription redemption processes that are much closer to the traditional way of investing into these assets. And then finally, given that, you have to pick the right architecture. And if you talk with institutions, and this is also where we come from as a founding team, they're not terribly comfortable with public blockchain protocols for various reasons that I'm not going to go into now. So we, to sum all of that up, as a result of that, we built our own hybrid private blockchain protocol. Part of it comes from R3 Corda, part of it comes from Hyperledger and Hyperledger Indy, and that enables us to digitize the existing asset management workflows that our clients are already handling. So on a high level, that is a very different technical approach than a lot of projects that you see out there, but that is by design for us.
Okay, so the answer is it's complicated.
I can go into a lot of detail, although not being an engineer, but I don't want to bore the room and waste our time.
Appreciate it. So maybe let's do a last question, and it would be good to get a yes or no answer to that from all of you, but maybe then also some elaboration if you guys feel like it. Is it the next big thing, or is it just a hype?
Okay, you know me.
Please start.
I can't stick to the rules. It's both. It's both. Why? You look at the typical evolvement of any new technology, and there is actually, for everybody who's interested, I highly recommend looking into an economics framework that is called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. It's fantastic. So you look at that, and every technological revolution runs through the same phases. Again, for lack of time, I'm not getting into it, except for two of those phases. Phase number 3 is the crazy hype phase, Why is it important? Because the speculative capital flows into the space and powers the good, the bad, the ugly, all the projects. Phase 4 is where everything calms down. Actually, people are disappointed. Asset prices are coming down. Everybody says this was a fad. It's going to die and go away. This
Like
is the phase
right now,
we're in
basically.
right now. What happens? All the bad guys are being washed out. Fantastic. The good guys still have money in the bank because
Still
they're
on
smart.
stage, yeah.
They have good projects. They have some clients. They will survive. And then we enter phase 5, which is the longer-term, broader distribution phase. You have to have the hype, and then you can go to the long-term value of it.
Okay, so that's a clear, that's a good comment. Like, what about you guys?
I'd say it's definitely the future. We probably won't have a lot of assets that are traded the way they are traded now. I think you're going to see NASDAQ, you're going to see a CBOE, CME, all of these big institutions are going to adopt some sort of blockchain framework that's going to make them interoperable or cross jurisdictions, because that's just the nature of capitalism. So if I buy up all the markets, what's the next step? Well, then I'm going to have one big market, right? And I think that's the question that we're going through right now. What is the technology that's going to be the solution? And then that just comes at whatever exchange ends up being successful, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be the best technology. It's just the old Betamax versus a VHS argument. Whatever the one that the people end up being most comfortable with, that's going to be the technology solution. We're still finding that.
So the next big thing. What about you?
So I do. So if there is going to be any institutional money in crypto, this is what is going to bring it in, because this is something that regulators understand. Institutions have 100 years of experience in it, and there's some guarantees behind it, unlike in the more recent ICO boom. I think that we're going to see. I think that it will be kind of slow going initially, and we're not quite exactly sure what sort of companies will begin to use it. Mostly, it's going to be assets that are typically illiquid. We're seeing a lot of interest from real estate, debt instruments, of course, equities. But the market is going to sort that out. That will take some time. But I think that once it establishes itself, I think it will basically, there'll be a hockey stick effect, and it will take off very quickly. I expect for the first year it'll be kind of a mixed bag of investments.
Can I ask very quickly, when do you think we are at the juncture where that hockey sticks?
We're flatlining right now.
Yeah.
I mean, so we're looking for new issuances. We're trying to find, really discover the really what appeals to the market, and the right sort of instruments that have the appropriate transfer mechanisms that can make a really healthy market. But we don't expect it to be like an HFT market, like a crypto market. It'll probably be more of an investors type market, at least initially. But it'll certainly be more liquid than the existing private shares market.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate your time here on the panel as well. And have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.